you will be able to message me, but you'll be on mute at my end, so I won't hear you, or I won't hear many of you anyway. So I'll just adjust this volume so people can maybe hear it a bit better. How's that, guys? And I'll just see if that's okay. That's better. Wonderful. All right. Well, look, welcome everyone. I know when we looked at this webinar, it was the idea of looking at how do we rebuild relationships and recovery. And I only did a staff training today, and in doing the staff training, a lot of people that know me when I lecture here at South Pacific, I really just want to put up Pia Melody's version of reality, the body, thoughts, feelings, and behaviour every time. So we're going to do a bit more of that today. I can never really talk about relationships within our model without talking about our model. So for you guys, I want you to bear with me, and as I lead you through how we head back from our, I suppose, knowing ourselves, so then we can be in relationship with others. So I'll start from the beginning. So I'll just move us along. All right. So what do we know about relationships and recovery? I think one of the things that I'm really clear about with this model is that the bottom right-hand column there of this model says that through treatment, recovery, intimacy, and reparenting, it supports the development of this functional adult. I think what excites me at the moment about treatment and recovery is that there's the interpersonal neurobiological information that's available to us now. We've worked within our model, a developmental model now at South Pacific for 21 years. The Meadows has been going about 36, 37 years. And we lucked in. We were lucky. We got this through Bill and Lorraine, who went over to the Meadows, and they experienced going through treatment, the Changes program, the family program, and really looking at we address our secondary symptoms by looking at what's underneath. And I think most excitingly it's saying, well, look, there's as Pia calls it, a joy, pain to recovery. I need to feel that I can, I've got to be able to I'm excited that I'm doing something that's good for me, but I've also got to grieve that the fact I'm doing something good for me means that I need to do something good. And that generally means that we're in recovery from something. And so with the functional adult that's growing those skills, it's taking responsibility. I've got to learn to esteem myself. I've got to learn to set boundaries. I've got to learn to get to know who I am, my body, my thoughts, my feelings, my behaviour, and from that data identify needs and appropriately get them met. Our model is not named accidentally. It's a developmental immaturity model. So I've got to learn to mature. And if I can develop those 4 skills, I can be in the moment, spontaneous, open, and moderate better. So if I can't do any of that, I'm not going to have good relationships. It's that simple. And so the beginning of recovery is getting to know yourself before we get to know anyone else. In the model we certainly talk about in that functional adult skills, I've got to become aware of and appropriately meet my needs. Now, I'm a recovering alcoholic and addict. I work with people with addiction issues now. You know, many folks that come into treatment usually have gone to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a counsellor, and they've talked about their issues. But we, especially if you've got addiction issues, we'll regularly in the beginning of recovery or when we're just contemplative about our problems say, look, I want to get well, I want to feel better, but I don't really want to give up the stuff that makes me feel better. And I think eventually what happens if you stay in your addiction long enough, you get to a point of desperation where it's not working like it used to, but you don't really know the way forward. And that's how people arrive here. At the bottom of the secondary symptoms and relational problems, it says that we end up in unmanageability and crisis and intimacy issues. So by the time people get here, their relationships are generally not only not good, but they're in the minus. We've damaged them through dishonesty and closed-mindedness and unwillingness to sort of participate in an open, collaborative level. We're in trouble generally. So for us to move forward and get any value out of knowing ourselves so we can know other people is we've got to know what we're dealing with. when we're looking at our secondary symptoms, what we know these days around addiction, it's the arousal template in the brain. So rarely people come into treatment these days with one addiction issue, but regularly people come into treatment saying, well, look, I want to give up my drinking, but I don't want to give up my gambling. I don't want to give up my sex and love addiction just yet. I just want to deal with the big dog that's biting my leg. And I think I talked about that last time in relapse prevention. So if I want to come in and do relationships differently in recovery, I've got to get a better sense of who I am and what are the things that are going to unsettle me, dysregulate me when I'm in a relationship. If I'm not treating my depression, if I'm not treating my bipolar, if I'm not treating my eating disorder, if I'm not treating my addictions or comorbidity, several addictions at once, depression, anxiety happening at once, and with an addiction issue. So part of what we introduce to folks here is that here's a chance to put all this stuff on the table, because if we don't deal with this, we are going to rely on it. I mean, I dealt with my alcoholism for a long time by using alcohol. It was fantastic, but then the consequences became too great. So when people arrive for treatment, what we hope is that they are able to work with us to get a really clear sense of, look, these are the issues that I'm relying on. These are the things that I turn to, or the symptoms I end up in that cause me stress, cause my life to be unmanageable, and they then go into those intimacy issues. And I suppose the part of what we hope to do, if I flick back to that earlier slide, is that's where we need to develop this functional adult. And part of that becoming aware of, in that fourth column down, is become aware of and appropriately meet my needs. So if I've got depression and anxiety, what pharmacological support, what psychotherapeutic support do I need? If I've got an addiction issue, what am I going to do around a recovery and relapse plan that can support me to move forward and get some decent support instead of relying on the actual drug of addiction, etc., to do it. So, of course, what we remind folks here is that untreated primary symptoms lead to secondary symptoms. So if we just get well from our secondary symptoms, whether it be management of our depression, anxiety, management of our addiction issue, that doesn't equal recovery. Not in our model. I mean, one of the blessings of South Pacific's model is we know that unless people look at the underlying issues that lead to those secondary symptoms that then result in the unmanageability, that result in the crises and the intimacy issues, we won't actually get real recovery at depth. So part of that becoming aware of is the two recoveries that we need to be in if we're really going to get well. One is from those secondary symptoms, but then secondly, looking more deeply at where have I ended up in regards to my self-esteem. What was the experiences that I had around the creation of my sense of value? Now, what we know about this model, we talk about the concept of the wounded child and the adult adapted child. But today we were doing training here around Dr. Dan Siegel's Wheel of Awareness, and I'm going to take us through some of those principles, and I'm going to set folks up shortly with this idea about how am I going to be able to be in a relationship with others if I can't regulate myself? So that's when we're talking about regulation and being in family systems and relationships. Let me just take you to the idea of these primary symptoms and how they relate to some of the information that's coming through from the neurobiologists, the fellows like Dan Siegel. When they look at developmental trauma, which our model says is at the core of our secondary symptoms, right from early on, even pre-verbal relationships and the attachment bond, etc., we know that if there's any trauma, the way our brain develops these days, we have more information about that than ever before. And when we have that developmental trauma, what Dr. Dan Siegel and the interpersonal neurobiologists talk about when they describe the primary symptoms is that they say that when we have those traumatic issues, we end up in a state of chaos in regards to our internal world, and therefore when we're in chaos and unable to regulate our internal world, I can't be in a relationship in stability with people in my external world. Now chaos, that idea of that there's a chaos that forms at a neurobiological level really fits well with our model. Now experientially we arrived at that years ago, this idea that this chaos lives in our sense of value, in our sense of safety, and how we set physical boundaries, sexual physical boundaries, and internal boundaries, how we understand our reality, and interestingly enough, this idea of interpersonal neurobiology when it comes to our attachment issues is that we're looking at this model in I suppose, a more sophisticated way now. It's not just our brain doesn't live in our skull and our thoughts just don't happen in our mind up in that frontal cortex region. It says it's really highlighting that it's our mind and the interpretation of that trauma that leads folks to be in a dysregulated state. And if I'm not regulating, I can't be in relationship and regulating. And in actual fact, if you look at our secondary symptoms, one of the observations Pia Melody made was when we have developmental trauma that's fundamentally abandonment-based, we will notice that our intimacy issues will actually be around a neediness that gets projected onto others that generally only attracts folks that went through, as a developmental trauma, enmeshment with a major caregiver who get their value and identity by being there for others. So we get that love addiction and love avoidance addiction dance. So the reason I mention that right now is this is about relationships. And so the only way I can really move forward in my relationships, if I've got that sort of developmental trauma, I've got to have some sort of awareness of that so I can get some mastery to build the right skills I need to actually be in an intimate relationship. Now, a lot of folks, when they come to SPP, when we say do our love addiction lecture, they identify with it immediately. And there's others that come in and they don't get it straight away. And for some, that abandonment and enmeshment mightn't have necessarily been the core developmental trauma, so it mightn't be an intimacy issue for them of that nature. But generally, we will see that in a family system, there'll be a fundamental abandonment or enmeshment. And the irony is that both, if you're enmeshed, that is a form of abandonment, that your needs aren't being met, but a relationship was provided where if you meet the needs of another, you'll able to get some of those core developmental needs met, the self-esteem, the sense of safety, the sense of meaning around your identity, etc. So we come into treatment, this idea that abstinence doesn't equal recovery and our developmental trauma impacts our internal systems, leads us in our model to this idea, well, I need to develop these functional adult skills so I can live in my skin better. I know I joke sometimes in lectures here where I say that here's some things you can write in your pencil case. So I'll do it in this webinar right now. Here's something you can write in your pencil case. It's good to tell your friends so they don't think you're just crazy and you've come to a psychiatric hospital. But we come here sometimes to feel better, and we leave here better at feeling. And this is better at feeling in action. How do I live in my skin, start to value myself, start to protect my reality, start to know what my reality is, and get a sense of what needs and wants arise out of that data. If I can start to read that and get the support for that, I was talking with our clinical therapy team today about how we are in the role here of reparents, that this idea of reparenting that Pia Melody talks about when it comes to developing the functional adult skills, that there's only two places that Pia talks about having a boundary set for us. One is in childhood and the other is in a consenting therapeutic alliance with a therapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. So our role here is to help folks to get that sense of, from that functional adult space where they're sitting today, look back at these primary symptoms and start to obtain the meaning that they're giving the world around them and the world inside of them. One of the things that I think is really exciting coming out of Dr. Dan Siegel's work and Dr. Alan Shaw's work is that it's not the trauma that affected us that we need to really look at. It's the meaning that we give that trauma after the fact. And it's that meaning that we can, in therapy, start to rewrite and recalibrate. The neuro-linguistic programmers knew this, the narrative therapists knew this. If we can just look at that story that we took out of that and rewrite that story in a way that at least make meaning of our life, that seems to have a significant impact. Now, one of the significant factors that they look for these days when we're looking at what creates resilience in children. Now, one of the early studies that got Dr. Dan Siegel onto this information was that he was saying that how do we measure the resilience in a person? How do we get a sense of what's a predictable factor for resilience to grow? And what they found, and this was an overwhelming awareness that they got out of this research that he did, was that one of the most determining factors was in a child growing up and building resilience was that the adult caregiver in that relationship had made sense of their own life. It didn't have to be that they had a trauma-free life, but when they were in that parenting role, why they were able to regulate was that they had a sense of awareness, which is in our model that dependency functional adult skill of I become aware of and I then can appropriately meet that need. And so when they started to look at developmental trauma, they noticed that even if someone had a developmental trauma, if in that parenting role they knew how to make sense of that, then what you got from that is the ability to be in relationship and regulate and co-regulate with what can happen with our most closest and most intimate relationships. I thought that was a really interesting thing because we noticed that here at South Pacific, that if I can be in a good reparenting relationship, a good relationship with my therapist, they can stay in those difficult times with me, help me to understand myself better, then that learning to regulate in company like that, learning to regulate in, if you think back here for you guys that came through our primary groups, sitting in primary group and not sort of knowing really, not making sense necessarily of your own story, but you start with your timelines and you start with first steps and you go down to changes and talk about your sort of 0 to 18 years, and then you do family and you look at those relationships. At the end of that, what we know comes from that is someone, you know, if you've been through it as a client and you've been honest, open and willing, you're leaving here with a different sort of story. It's the same facts, but all of a sudden there's more compassion, there's more curiosity. We've still got work to do, there's no doubt that SPP is the beginning of something, not the end. But what I think is significant, it's the beginning of looking at our life differently and rethinking it, giving it another meaning. And I think one of those main things is we start to grow that compassion. We look back compassionately at times. We learn that forgiveness is more for ourselves than it is for anyone else, and people start to grieve. They start to deal with the feelings that go with that old story, and they start to write a new story. And that's something that we'll talk about shortly, is this idea of, well, what sort of families are we in? And one of the things I'm always moved by is when you come into SPP and sit in any of our testimonials, people will mention therapists and be very thankful, and there'll be aha moments and they're grateful for that experience. But then they'll look at the community, the people that have been in the trenches with them, going through it, hearing it day by day, and they always get the biggest praise. And I think that's what happens here. You know, what I like about this work that's coming through is that we simply don't exist. Our brain doesn't exist in our skull. It's an embodied organ that is connected right through a sophisticated set of systems throughout our whole body. And therefore, our experience of the world doesn't stop at our skin. And so when we're in group, we have this experience that sort of tells us that. But I suppose where we're heading with treatment and where we're heading with trauma work and developmental trauma is that we can actually sort of learn skills that put me in a better relationship with that internal-external world. Dr. Daniel Siegel says that there's an I, there's a you, and there's and I suppose he loves acronyms, but a we, a you and a me together, and that's how we do recovery. And I think that testimonial sort of statements people make reflect that how moved people are with the impact of having people around them, sharing their stories, hearing their stories over and over. So regulation, what are we talking about regulation? And I think in the South Pacific we're saying, well, we need to develop these functional adult skills so then we can manage these inner children. Now, of course, there's no inner children inside of us. But yet, if you've been through our Changes program with Elizabeth or done any of our constellations work that's done by Maria Dolnick and that comes through here, then what we see is people, there's no inner children in us, but when you start to act those out in a psychodrama or a constellation, really quickly you get that picture of how you can be different, radically different, and reflecting those ego states, that inner, the wounded child, where it feels less than, really unsafe and too vulnerable, bad and flawed and rebellious in that tantrum sort of three-nager type of way, and when it comes to our needs and wants, that we completely make others responsible for them, where we're just too needy and we project everything outside of ourselves. And when you live like that, that's that chaos, that out of control. So the first thing that we talk about here at SPP is I've got to learn to, I've got to reparent that part of me that when I dysregulate, I've got to start that job. Now, when I was talking to the clinical therapy team today, it's about, wow, how we involve ourselves in that relationship. We know now that trauma holds itself in the body, that a lot of CBT skills when it comes to developmental trauma are not the skills we need to lead with, that we, for us to be there and be of service to you guys, we've got to be in our own body. I've got to be able to regulate my own system. And we at South Pacific are really starting to get that as a clinical team now with our nurses and our clinicians, because we're wanting to make sure that we regulate ourselves so we're of better service to you, so we can be available for that reparenting role to teach you guys to reparent, to look after yourself. I was talking today about powerlessness, and I think that years ago this concept of powerlessness around addictions come from the 12-step world. We admitted that we were powerless and our lives have become unmanageable. Our definition of powerlessness has changed with all this brain science that's been making itself available. We've known for years in treatment, even experiential treatment, that we're not powerless over the behaviour, otherwise we'd be all robots. But we're certainly powerless over the way that there's the patterns of neurons that have been formed, those neuro pathways, when it comes to identification with events that are around addiction. And then over time our arousal template is sort of wired to respond and becomes hijacked by these activities, and therefore lessens the pleasure that we feel with other things that were once upon a time an exciting part of our life. All of a sudden the only thing that we're interested in is our addiction. So when it comes to regulation here, we want to start to acknowledge that the powerlessness now is so much more than just our cognition, the thoughts, the meanings that we give things. What we know now, if you've experienced developmental trauma in the way that the amygdala and the way the hypothalamus has been impacted in its development, when we've experienced trauma, and if we've experienced trauma from folks that were our major caregivers, then we were trying to protect ourselves with our limbic system and yet get our needs met with that part of the brain that's instinctually driven to make sure that we can survive. How that's affected what we do with trauma is just dramatic. And what it's led us to be, to look at South Pacific is, wow, we've got to use this functional adult and its relationship with these ego states, this wounded child and adult adapted child, to really start to learn these regulation skills through mindfulness, through being in touch with the body, through locating how our system seems to react at a sophisticated level, and start to learn those skills so we're not just reaching back out for those either drugs or addiction or comfort foods or comfort behaviours that just take the edge off. And while we continue to rely on them, we're never going to be fully available for ourselves, therefore we're never fully available for our relationships. So let me just move this slide on here. So I know when I was talking to our, I was trying to think of, to Jackie Grant, we're talking, she's our manager for public relations and helps me put these projects together. I said, listen, we need an image for how do we teach folks to become an interpersonal neurobiologist, and we thought, well, the Muppets, you can't go past the Muppets, folks. Very scientific image there, and they've even got some very scientific machines there that I'm sure are completely unnecessary for what we're about to talk about. But we've got to have fun with this. I think one of the feedbacks we get from people who go to 12-step meetings is that when they attended 12-step meetings, they noticed something significant. People were laughing there, and they weren't laughing at each other. They were laughing with each other. And I think that's part of this journey. Pia coined the phrase, I believe, joy pain, that it's painful to have to get into recovery and address these issues. But once we admit it, once we accept it, once we move on with it, and we put ourselves in a community of others that are on that road with us, there's some joy that goes with that. We're finally not alone. And so this idea of, well, I've got to take responsibility for this, and yet we can still get support. I can still see a therapist. I can still see a doctor. I can still, get information and relationships that can support me with this. But basically, we do this journey alone. I see this happen when people are leaving treatment, doing their testimonials. Really, they don't want to come in here, and then we don't want to leave when we get to treatment. It's like, yeah, no, I want to take you guys home with me, And I even remember a speaker called Bob Earl on one of his tapes. He's a recovering, I suppose you can get a lot of his tapes out there, and he talked about at home sometimes when he got really lonely, and if he knew he was going crazy, he made the point that he never even felt suicidal until he got into recovery, until he gave up his drugs of addiction. He had to learn to manage those states of stress that when he hit them before, he'd just use his drugs of addiction. And so when he got into recovery, he used to joke about he'd put stuffed bears and animals around the kitchen table and have a meeting at home in the middle of the night just to stay sane. And I think that's that narrative, just telling his story. And I know he made jokes when he used to share about that, but I could see him at that table. And I think a lot of folks in recovery have those dark nights of the soul where they journal or they pray just to get through the night. So this is a big journey that people take on. And we know now that it usually takes about 1 to 5 years to really address secondary symptoms, address primary symptoms, and if you've had developmental trauma, learn how to be more comfortable in your own skin. So this idea about interpersonal neurobiology and how we need to change the way we do the relationship with self and others, at the moment I think is the most exciting news in the psychology field. So, mindfulness, we've known for a long time now in recovery that meditation and prayer can be really helpful. And over the years through 12-step fellowships throughout the 12 steps, they start a relationship with a power greater than itself, at least get us in contact with our higher consciousness. I know one of the acronyms for God for people that struggle with the concept of a higher power is good orderly direction. If I was in my wise mind, if I was to get in contact with my higher consciousness, or slow down my dysregulated state and just get in touch with that more peaceful place, that we can actually make clearer and better decisions. In actual fact, in step 11 in the 12-step program, they talk about, well, through prayer and meditation, praying only for the knowledge of God's will, only for the direction that comes from within, as being the only course of action. That why, we've got a Ferrari in the garage, let's use it, let's not catch the bus. So this idea of, in treatment, we try and bring that idea at South Pacific, and we were talking about it again today, of how do we bring some of this new information in, and some of the things I'll steer you towards at the end of this webinar are some resources that are available right now on the net, that if you were to start to access them on a daily basis right now, you'll be actually becoming that interpersonal neurobiologist for your own state. So starting to use this mindfulness in a very directed way, and that's what I want to get on to talking about now. If we're going to regulate our system, we need to have a better understanding of our system. Now, in Pia's world, we talk about the body, the thoughts, and the feelings, and the behaviour being a very basic template for our understanding of self. And then within that template, of course, it's very sophisticated. one of the I suppose awarenesses that Dr. Dan Siegel brought to this world of is this idea. He created a couple of things that I think now will hopefully become really clear parts of modern treatment. One is when he started to lecture on this when he was in medical school and then going around the world, as he developed this idea of mind sight and introspection and getting a sense of the data that was really getting collected by the attachment theorists, and then we started to match that with the ability to MRI a living brain and start to get a stronger and deeper sense of research, that we thought, well, wow, this is this idea that we're dealing with in mental health is we understand the brain as a mechanism, but we have no idea about this sense of the mind. And in actual fact, when he started to contemplate, well, what is the mind, he started to run it past his colleagues at university, is that really he came up with a lot of contention. The spiritualists and that didn't want to define it, the researchers didn't want to define it because they were researching it, and he realized we fairly quickly have to come up with a definition of the mind that's separate from the brain. And one of the, I suppose, founding principles of how he arrived at this difference of the brain and the idea of the mind and consciousness is that with our mind we have the ability to choose what we focus on. Even if we've got neuropathways that are developed over years, that in recovery very quickly people learn how to change their focus. And if we can change our focus, then we can learn to regulate again. We can learn to experience our system differently, even if it's difficult to do in the beginning, because we have got those neural pathways that are hardwired to head in a certain direction, that we need to look at, well, how do we become able to manage that differently? Now, that's a whole lot of information that I'm excited to be able to steer towards some of those MP3s that are available on Dan Siegel's website, that he'll be able to much more articulately describe than I can today. So why am I bringing this up? As a functional adult skill, I need to grow my awareness about what's happening inside of myself. And so this meditation that you'll be able to tune into later on about this idea of this wheel of awareness is that, firstly, it's acknowledging that, as I said before, our brain and the way that our mind functions just doesn't live inside of our skull. That's just the organ, but it's connected through a whole lot of sophisticated systems throughout our body. And then in this meditation, it's about then steering our awareness around so we can regulate not just our internal world, but our relationships to the external world, which then affects how we do relationships. He does it in 4 quadrants. He says that the main thing that we focus our awareness on is he calls it the hub there, that the center of self is this idea of the mind. It can be aware, it can be open, it can be peaceful, it can be calm, and in that state we can receive, we're receptive, we get clear information. He describes it as like floating in the ocean, the deep ocean, under the surface, say about 20 meters down, looking up at the surface of the ocean, and that the idea that we can become aware and focus our attention is that I can be in a deep and peaceful place and look outside of myself at the incoming data. And he makes that similar to sort of being under the water and looking up at the surface, and we can see that the surface, the waves crashing, we can see that the surface can change, but underneath we can have that separateness from it and then be in awareness of it. He'll take folks through the 5 senses of awareness, the touch and taste and smell and sound and I'm not even thinking there in regards to the last part of that awareness, but sight and hearing, of course. And so we need to become aware of that. And if we start to tune into that to regulate, if you listen to the meditation I'm going to steer towards at the end of this as a resource, that we need to just start with that basic data perception. Then he talks about that 6th sense, that once we get a sense of that data, we need to pay attention to the interior of the body, skeletally, muscularly, our sense of our organs and our gastro systems, and just tuning in to how we have an awareness of that, whether our tummy's rumbling or upset, whether our heart's racing, whether if we feel any pains or soreness in the body, etc., and really tuning into that and then starting to regulate and calm that. The seventh sense that he talks about, mental awareness, starting to pay attention of what am I focusing on? How am I making sense of things? What are the meanings I'm giving things right now? Without judging them, without trying to change them, but just trying to tune into that. Now, for a lot of addicts and a lot of codependents, that information, we run from it with everything we've got. And so this is that sort of going inside, really looking at it, and having a good sense of self. So if we do that 5 senses, 6 sense, interior of the body, 7th sense, mental activities, what we're making up about things. Last but not least is putting our attention out into our sense of interconnectedness. Who am I in relationship with? In the meditation, it's about, well, who's in the room with me? Who's in the building with me? Who's in the street with me? Who's in the community? Who's in our country? Who's in the continent? Who am I connected to? The children, mother, father, pets, a sense of land, elders past and present, and really getting a sense of that sense of the world outside of our skin, how our skin relates to the world, and then the significant relationships within. Through doing this sort of focusing our mindful meditation on these certain activities, we not only start to create new pathways in the brain, but the exciting part of the information here is that we actually start to look at the already formed pathways. The exciting thing in neurobiology is the malleability of the brain, the ability to change what's already existing in there. Now, I'm not going to go into that. As I said, I'm going to steer towards some resources that, if you're interested and curious about that, can be really helpful. If I can manage my own state, if I can start to do this and know when I'm losing my sense of regulation and pull back and use some of those skills that we talk about in SBP, if I can get my functional adult to notice that my wounded child's been triggered, that I do a level and I identify, wow, this is triggered from my past, that relationship with my grandfather and my father, or what this reminds me of is when X or Y happened, and that's the meaning I'm carrying into this experience right now. That's the toxic level of feeling and the toxic shame that's been triggered. If I've got that data, I'm inside my own skin differently, and I'm going to do relationships differently. And instantly, if I can be more curious and compassionate about what's happening inside of me, one of the things that I then therefore bring to relationships is I bring curiosity and compassion to the relationship. Pia talks about 3 things that I sometimes forget, but I've always been in love with. She said that there's 3, when it comes to parenting, therefore reparenting, that we need to have the ability to give time, give attention, and then from that we get to give direction. Too often in parenting, when we're under stress and we're not regulating well, we go to direction. We just want to get someone to be different so I'm okay, without spending the time, without giving the attention, so we can sort of get the data we need to then go into some compassion and curiosity, especially if we can have some good boundaries in place. When Pia says that we're not able to regulate and that we haven't got that ability to have boundaries, have that data, know what our needs are, move to get them met, then what's going to happen is we generally are going to be in a relationship, that we're going to be arguing facts. I think I heard this morning on a resource from Dan's website, he talked about there's no such thing as immaculate perception, that no one's got a corner on the market. You've only got a corner on your market. So when I'm hearing when I'm sharing my reality, it's just my version of it. And if I don't get curious about what your version of, well, we're really going to miss. So this idea that if we don't have these functional adult skills in my relationships, I'm going to argue facts, keep score, and assign blame. And when I heard that, I remember feeling some healthy shame, thinking, wow, when I'm under stress, that's where I can go. And when I look back at my earlier relationships and recovery, I was pretty overwhelmed by the thought of how often I got caught into the black and white arguments of arguing facts, trying to get someone to see it my way. When they didn't, assigning blame, and then that whole idea of, I don't think anyone likes to put their hand up to keeping score, but it's amazing in relationship how you very quickly go back to that keeping score. So this idea then, if I can regulate, if I can notice this stuff about me, I'm going to be in a relationship in a different way than I'm experiencing relationships when I'm not regulating. So this idea in recovery that we come up with, that if I'm going to be in better relationships, I've got to work out what families I'm in. So early on in recovery, we talk about our family of origin issues. I've got to learn what my developmental trauma is. I've got to learn what the impact of the things I went through in my childhood are. I've got to look at the family roles. I've got to look at the defense mechanisms that I learned being within that family to get my needs met. So having a sense of my family of origin is really important. And then when we go back into relationships in our family of origin, especially if, I mean, we're really lucky at SPP. We've got this wonderful family program that starts people on that road to doing their family relationships differently. But it's a hard road, let's face it. And when you go back home very quickly, if we don't regulate, we can end up back in the same horror and loss that we were in, the unmanageability and crisis that we arrived at before we come to treatment. So really quickly, we've got to work out, especially if there's a lot of trauma, how am I going to be in that family relationship and still practice these functional adult skills? And I'd say, well, the one way to do that is in this ability to regulate, taking responsibility to regulate. The other family we have is a family of creation. So usually people have come in here and they might be in a significant relationship. They've got their own children now, and that can be a bittersweet pill, because you come here and you go, wow, I've got these developmental trauma issues from my past, but I've also been part of passing this family legacy on in the present, and that can be a real shock sometimes to have to deal with those issues. The third family that can happen in recovery is a family of choice. And this is one that I rabbit on when I run relapse prevention or do the aftercare lectures. This journey is hard enough to do on your own, and it's crazy to do it on your own when there's communities of people. And I really hope that people take the ability and the pleasure that they got from being in that family that they created here for themselves when they're in treatment out into the world. Find your 12-step fellowships, find your depression, anxiety support groups, find your yoga or self-esteem, or find a tribe out there that is more about the health than it is about the disease. Having that family of choice can be really helpful. An example I could give you is that early on when I was looking at developmental trauma, I remember that Christmas became a real trigger. I still would go to Christmas, but I worked out that with a bunch of peers, we had our own Christmas party. We would have on Christmas Eve, we would get people in recovery, we'd get together, we'd have Kris Kringle, we'd have a nice meal, we'd share gifts, and then basically I remember thinking, wow, by learning to be in that family of choice differently, it made over the years being in the family of origin all that more easier, because I could be compassionate and curious. In our family program, we used Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, and recently we were going through that with staff around giraffe ears, that if I learn to be able to regulate my own sort of neurobiology, my own system, I can then practice skills with other people that mightn't even have the ability to be in recovery or share in a way that's regulated itself, but I can still listen with what they call giraffe ears, this idea of listen compassionately, listen with curiosity to see what's the unspoken need this person's saying. Is there a way that I can collaborate and meet and join with this person? There mightn't be, but if I can at least observe what's the unspoken need underneath, it can open the space in the relationship for at least me not being defensive, not going into old relationship patterns that sort of create what they fear. And I think that becomes a really exciting thing to bring in a relationship, because for some folks, and my family was the same, they never entered recovery, they never went to a 12-step meeting, they never even saw a therapist. But the fact that I did my 50% so dramatically differently, the way that safety was created over years in that family of origin, and the way I did my own family of creation differently meant that I was able to be in my family of origin really differently. And I see that happen for many folks in recovery. And so when people come into treatment and they say, look, my family aren't interested, I don't know how this is going to work, they don't have to be interested. You can make it significantly different. So one of the things we say here at South Pacific is we're about breaking the family legacy. It's one of the wonderful things Lorraine says when she lectures on, she tells the story of recovery. And what I think is exciting now, and this, as I mentioned before, that when we start to break the family legacy, we do this now at depth. We are that we are that interpersonal neurobiologist. We've become a scientist in our own life. We can actually change the way we experience ourselves from the inside out. From the bottom up, we can do things differently. Cognitively, emotionally, behaviorally, we do things differently. But what changes those is us taking responsibility now for our recovery, that neurobiologically we're impacted by developmental trauma, and that the fact that there's this neuroplasticity of the brain that I can through repetition and putting myself into a healthy family of choice and different sorts of relationships, I can start to change the way and the meaning I gave the past, and therefore change the way that I experience myself in the present. And I think the thing that's most exciting about this phrase we've had here for years, let's break the family legacy, is the fact that the malleability of the brain, the ability for us that within the neuron, within the cell, with the right down to where our DNA sits, is that we're noticing that the power of this sort of work in learning to regulate and do relationships differently, it changes that structure that then gets passed on throughout the generations. If I were to talk any further with any more depth around that, I'll highlight my ineptness in being able to describe it. But as I said, if you were to move on after this and look at Dr. Dan Siegel's website and start to have a look at his wheel of awareness and to practice the meditations and listen to his lectures, you'll certainly get that at depth. So I think we're pretty close, folks. I mentioned this about signs in a relationship. We're operating from that immaturity and the primary symptoms, the arguing facts, assigning blame, and keeping score. And I know in our program here and in family, we certainly look at blame's not a relationship skill, it's a defense mechanism. And so if those three things really are helpful to you, if you feel the healthy shame I did when I certainly identified them, please, they're great. They're three things to have in the fridge. And if you listen to Pia Melody's Mapping Your Recovery resource, you can get that from the Meadows, and she speaks about it online on YouTube. She used to say that when they noticed that they were doing this, when she was doing it with Pat, her husband at the time, that they simply stopped talking. They realized that they were back in their primary symptoms. Nothing was going to come of it. There's no immaculate perception. So they just literally stopped and then learned to just walk away, get some support, and come back when they could actually have the boundaries, not assign blame, not argue the facts, and keep score. And I think please take that stuff into your relationships with therapists and etc. If you're noticing that, wow, that's what I do, please get some support around that. I mentioned the giraffe ears and the Marshall Rosenberg, that it's a really, we handed out here recently because we're about to go into the rebuild, and we're very excited here as a team about the rebuild in the hospital, and we thought, well, that at times is going to lead to some stressful moments with staff and with new clients coming in to experience the program. And so we've all got giraffe ears, folks. I think even in my office here, I've got a couple of sets of giraffe ears, and it just helps us to listen to the unspoken needs. So again, please look that up. You'll find him online. It's an amazing resource. That's Marshall Rosenberg, and this will come through as a. We'll be making this available online, so you'll be able to hear that name again. But it's nonviolent communication, and as I said, it's learning those skills that even with folks that aren't in recovery. So this comes in really handy in family of origin relationships where mom, dad, husband or wife doesn't really want to get into recovery, but you want to stay in relationship with them for whatever reason, that this skill becomes really helpful because you're not expecting them to try and learn to level or learn about boundaries, but you're able to be in relationship and hear what they need you to hear, even if they can't say it in such a way that's overly helpful. So being in a relationship is about being in a relationship. So we joke about it here. I said to Jackie when we put this together, it's a contact sport, and I don't mean bending at the waist and running into each other. It's not that sort of contact. Being in a relationship is about having contact, sharing to be known, taking a risk of identifying your needs and putting it out there, not getting it right. One of the wonderful things about the 12-step fellowship is if we muck it up, step 10, we continue to take personal inventory, and if we're wrong, we promptly admit it. It's been one of the real gifts to accept my perfect imperfectionist and go back to someone and say, look, that didn't go well. I want to apologize for the impact of that. Can I try again to share with you what's going on for me? That it's okay to have contact, not get it right, and repair. In a lot of folks that come through SPP, we've not come from family systems where we saw repair, where we saw people admit their wrongs and work through it make amends, and acknowledge the impact it had on others. So hopefully from our program you got the beginning of that. And as you're out there in your relationships, please, if you don't get it right and that sense of failure or it's not working comes up, please get some support around that, because we're not going to get it right every time. And in actual fact, when we get it wrong, we can promptly admit it, we can do it differently, and especially in a family system when there's children, if they can watch mum and dad go through that, it's the best way that we learn that we're perfectly imperfect, is to watch other people deal with that imperfection. So to establish in healthy boundaries and share reality, don't forget that the simple things that Pia says. The most important functional adult skills is healthy relationships. In a healthy relationship is boundaries. If I have good personal boundaries at a physical level, at a sexual level, at a cognitive emotional level, then what it will open up for me is a space. I'll get differentiation. I'll be able to have you there and me here, and within that gap I can exercise compassion and curiosity. And by practicing that leveling and exercise, I'm able to just give me that space for that differentiation to occur. This package that will come out with the slides for the PowerPoint will just give you that. It was in your manuals. If you haven't been through the SPP program and you're seeing this for the first time, this is a wonderful little resource to take with you as a way of, in nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg certainly talks about identifying the data without diagnosis, and so looking at what we saw and noticed and heard. And don't forget that leveling in the real world can be an awareness tool that you can have, and then we only have to share what our identified need is. We don't have to share the whole level, and we can use this as a journaling tool, so it keeps us able to identify the things that dysregulate us, and then through that wheel of awareness meditation or mindfulness we can start to learn the regulation skills. So folks, I suppose we're pretty well at the end of our webinar, and I think you know, when this model gets summed up of Pia Melodies, it's basically saying that it's about the developmental trauma is simply about disconnection and recovery and developing that functional adult that starts to reparent ourselves and then live in the world in a different way. It's about reconnection. And I think one of the wonderful things about reconnecting with myself first is I can get in touch with that vulnerability, and if I can protect that vulnerability and be vulnerable, then I'm able to be available to feel love and to give love and receive love. And so I suppose, you know, this idea of being able to be finally in relationship with a level of safety, then it opens us up for a world where there really is that joy and that hope. So, folks, thank you very much. I don't know if at the moment if there might be any questions or anything. I know I've gone over time. I've never been the greatest housekeeper. I've had some really good cues to be on time and haven't. I just get too excited. But if there's any questions, if you want to type them through, I'll try and answer a couple before we finish. And if not, you can certainly email us, email them to me, and I'll really try and get back to you. At the moment, I'm not seeing any questions, so maybe we'll be able to sign off. As I said, if there's any questions that come up for you about any of what I've said, please send them through. Just for the last time I'll mention, if you go to drdansiegel.com and look up his resources section of his website, you will get, we might even, we'll just type this up on our screen for you now so you've got it. So it's drdansiegel.com. And then look at his resources. You'll see the Wheel of Awareness, Introduction, and Meditation, and there's a few of them there at 15 minutes. They're 15 minutes long, 25 minutes long, 29 minutes long, and there's an 8-minute introduction. So please have a look at that and see how you go. I'd certainly try the meditation. Do it for a week and see if you really can live inside your skin a bit better. It's something we're going to roll out at South Pacific, and so we're pretty excited to have a look at that. And the other person I did mention was Marshall Rosenberg and nonviolent communication. So just Google Marshall Rosenberg or nonviolent communication, and there's an amazing amount of stuff on the YouTube that you can watch and learn about giraffes if you're keen. So look, folks, I'll probably sign off, and I think we have down in Okay, we do have something, so I will answer this. I find it hard to accept compliments from people. Can you touch on how to learn to allow these in? You know, that's wonderful. And it's a good question, because I think sometimes we can feel more shame if someone says something nice to us than if someone says something harmful to us. And I think the way to let a compliment in, firstly, is still exercising boundaries. Only I can determine what's true or not true is one of the ways of interpreting our internal boundary. So if someone says something nice to us, then that leveling format can be really helpful to sort of manage the shame. If we notice that we find it hard to let a compliment in, generally if you write a level, you'll notice that it's triggering something from your past, that the meaning that you give is really significant to work out, well, what meaning do you give it to someone? Sometimes it can come with mistrust, sometimes it can come with they're just saying it to be nice, and then the feelings that get triggered are really important to identify. But at the core there, I believe you're probably going to find toxic shame. How we let it in is that I'm responsible for managing that shame. So if I want to let a compliment in, essentially, if I notice that that triggers shame for me, I've sort of got to hug my inner toddler and then be in my functional adult so I can hear the compliment. And one of the skills that we can have at a boundary level is to just say, thank you. And then we might need to get extra support from somewhere else. If it was your sponsor or your therapist sharing a level, I remember sharing a compliment with someone once, and they had a wonderful level for me, and the level really was able to articulate that from their past, it brought up grief because they never got that warm regard. They never got that inherent worth developed as a result of that. And I thought it was fantastic because it was a good way of going, wow, I'm going to be in my functional adult and just share this shame so I don't carry it with me. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I'd certainly be using the leveling and getting support to learn to manage that relationship with the wound so you can hear the compliment. So excuse me for that, and look, folks, thank you very much for joining me. And the next month we'll have another one up. We'll have it on our Facebook, and I'm just getting a cue. We've got it's on the 12 steps, so that'll be an exciting one. And for you guys out there that are going, oh dear, the 12 steps, that'll be for the addicts and alcoholics. No, it won't. The 12 steps to happiness will be a resource I'll be drawing on. Excuse me. The 12 steps to happiness will be a resource I'm drawing on that means for depression, anxiety, eating disorders, personality disorders, and addictions, it'll be helpful. So look, thank you very much, and take care, and remember, you are a miracle. See you later.